Good morning again. Today is the last class, last hour. The lonely hour of the last instance never comes out to themselves. Anyway, okay. Today we are going to have a review, maybe actually, maybe not review, but let's draw some conclusions from what we had so far. Marx's analysis of capitalism argues that it's an unstable system, actually, because of two reasons. One is positive, if you will. One is negative. Positive meaning that I'm talking about competition process. I mean, within the classical political economy in general, competition is a dynamic process. It plays a dynamic role. Competition, free competition, of course, we are talking about here. Competition has two functions. One is to drive the system into equilibrium, long-run equilibrium, when the uniform profit rate occurs. There's a profit rate equalization among the sectors of the economy in the long run, so it has an equilibrating function. This is the first function of competition, but on the other hand, there's also another aspect of competition process, which is again dynamic, but this time it may bring about some unstable positions. The reason behind this is, of course, competition process forces capitalists to reduce the costs of production. And the best way of doing this is, of course, introducing machinery or in general technological innovations. So basically, technological innovations serve to increase labor productivity, and therefore it will bring the costs in general down. So this process actually creates a dynamic process of competition. And so on the basis of this idea, we can see that competition plays a dual role. On the one hand, it creates equilibrium in the long run. And on the other hand, interestingly, it creates disequilibria, so to speak, through the constant introduction of technological changes. Whenever there's any technological change or any change in the structure of the economy, then everything will change. Within this everything, of course, in the first place, we have a new structure of prices. So remember, prices of production depends on values and the distributive shares and technology. So, you know, within the Marxian structure, technology is, when we talk about equilibrium, of course, technology is taken as constant, you know, because otherwise it's not possible to determine prices of production. So whenever there's a new technology, whenever there's a change in technology in any way, it could be labor saving or capital saving, doesn't matter. But Marx usually says that it's usually labor saving. In that respect, he follows Ricardo. And he also adds that technological changes are controlled basically by the capitalist class in general. So they want to increase the productivity of labor on the one hand, but they don't want the laborers, the workers as a class, to become stronger as a result of this technological change. So even if there are new opportunities to increase labor productivity to a great extent, sometimes this new technology are deliberately not introduced into the production process. So this is part of the class struggle, according to him. This also implies that in a socialist economy, the, the pace of the technological change will be much faster. Well, this is an empirical claim, of course. It wasn't corroborated by the historical facts within the real socialist economies, such as the Soviet Union, etc. But this another aspect of technological change in Marx. In his book Das Kapital, chapter 15, he talks about this process to a great extent. Anyway, returning to the competition process, so introduction of new technology or increasing mechanization in Marxist language. Instabilities will be introduced within the competitive process. Some of the firms will be eliminated from the competitive process because they cannot keep up with the pace of technology and so forth. So it creates, competition creates both equilibrium and disequilibrium. Of course, another aspect of disequilibrium is the crisis theory or theories in Marx, especially if we are to talk about the falling rate of profit argument. This falling rate of profit as a tendency is caused by introduction of new machines, thereby the constant capital will increase, or the organic composition of capital will increase. So therefore, in the long run, as a secular tendency, of course, there will be a constant decrease in the rates of profit. So competition is a process that creates both stability and equilibrium, but at the same time, it also creates disequilibria and also crises. So this is an interesting aspect of Marx's capital accumulation theory in general. So on the basis of this, we can say that, as we talked about last time, capitalism is a system, according to Marx, which is inherently dynamic, and it has the potential to create greater and greater amount of capital, but at the same time, it carries the seed, so to speak, for its own destruction. So in the long run, there will be crisis, crisis from underconsumption of this or disproportionality or falling rate of profit. So basically, eventually, capitalism is doomed to collapse. But still, this process is dynamic, and capitalism is a successful system on this count. On the count of the capital accumulation process. So Marx's attitude toward capitalism is like a love and hate relationship. On the one hand, he admires capitalism because of its capacity of producing greater and greater amount of capital and also consumption goods. Of course, it has the potential to increase the growth process in general, and also he admires capitalism because he thinks that capitalism is a progressive step in the development of humankind in general, especially with regard to the increasing freedom. Capitalism creates the condition of greater and greater freedom as compared to other pre-capitalist modes of production, because under capitalism, the freedom of the individual becomes very important, which is also a condition for socialism, according to him, or communism in general. And also, capitalism increased the consciousness of human beings in that they become to see themselves as part of the humanity or as members of the species being. So basically, capitalism creates the conditions for the individual to realize herself in a greater extent, to a greater extent. This is an interesting aspect. On the other hand, of course, Marx's attitude towards capitalism is like a hate relationship, because he argues that capitalism increases the alienation process of the individual, and alienation is creating not freedom, unfreedom in general. So in order for human beings in general to be free, capitalism must be overthrown. Also, capitalism is inherently unstable in the sense that it has the potential to create crises and instabilities in general. So because of this, capitalism is doomed to failure in the long run, sooner or later. Of course, this failure of capitalism will also bring about by the workers, proletariat, as the instabilities of capitalism increases. Proletariat will reach class consciousness. They will resist capitalists, and class struggle will be intensified. And in the end, capitalism will be overthrown through revolution and so forth. That's the basic idea. So this is more or less Marx's attitude towards the capitalist system in general. So on the basis of these ideas, we can draw some conclusions about the Marxist political economy. Marxist political economy is important for some reasons. We have this conclusion here. Of course, I talk about the radical economics, but remember, radical economics means that basically, this is a quote from Marx's one of the early writings of Marx. To be radical is to grasp things by the root, but for the man, for the human being, the root is man himself, human being herself. Let's read it. So basically, we are talking about Marxist political economy, or Marx's own political economy. Okay, political economy is about the essences rather than appearances. Remember again, let me see. Okay, this economics must go deeper than the realm of exchange. Then the shallow conception of human being has our own economics. Remember, all science will be superfluous if the outward appearances and essences of things directly coincided. The idea is simple. In order to understand capitalism in its full extent, we should look beyond the appearances, beyond the empirical observations, on the in the face of the things. We can see that capitalism is a dynamic system, but also it creates equilibrium, and also it creates happiness for everyone, etc., etc. But if we go beyond the level of appearances, the level of prices, market prices, of course, we will see the real conditions that determine production and the conditions of exploitation, etc. So basically, the notions value, production, accumulation, and distribution should have analytical priority over prices and exchange and resource allocation. Remember again our discussion of the differences between between classical political economy and neoclassical political economy. In the neoclassical economics, we deal with appearances in general. It's a vulgar type of economics, according to Marx. This is not what Marx exactly says, but the idea is here. So they deal with neoclassical economics is concerned with the determination of market price on the basis of demand and supply interaction, etc. So if you generalize this mechanics into the general equilibrium throughout the whole economy, then we will have general equilibrium and efficient allocation of resources in the Pareto efficiency sense, etc. But when we look at the same economy from the perspective of Marxist political economy, you will see exploitation and relations of value as a social relation. Of course, commodity is a social relation. If you want to understand capitalism, you should understand this capital-labor relationship in general, because political economy is about relations among individuals and relations among relations in general. So basically, appearances are not enough to analyze and understand capitalism in general. You should go beyond that. It's a kind of realistic approach, as we have already discussed. And also, the second aspect of this Marxist political economics is that the importance of change and evolution, the development, the idea of development. The idea of development is a complex notion, actually. It not only refers to change, but it also refers to a kind of complex change, or a change through disequilibria. This notion of punctuated equilibrium is important in this regard. For example, this is a biological notion. Here we have this from Wikipedia, of course. Okay, this idea of punctuated equilibrium is a biological notion developed by Niles Eldridge here and Stephen J. Gould. This guy, especially Stephen J. Gould, is an important paleontologist, I guess. He's not a biologist, but he contributed a lot to the evolutionary biology. Anyway, this idea of punctuated equilibrium is a theory that proposes that once a species appears in the fossil record, the population will become stable. It's based upon an empirical observation, as you can see, showing little evolutionary change for most of its geological history. But then there comes some points of breaks within the evolutionary process. A new species, for example, will arise, or some of the existing species will become extinct, etc. So graphically speaking, it's something like this. This is an interesting thing. For example, we start from here, and then there comes a position that the system is forced to make a choice. It's like bifurcation, within the chaos theory. There are complexity and also theory. There are bifurcations. Things go smoothly in the first place. But then comes this position to make a choice. The system makes this choice. It's not a deliberate choice, of course. It's not a conscious choice, because we are talking about biological system or any kind of physical systems. Also conforms to this process. So, for example, life on the earth is very old, as we all know. There were dinosaurs once, and it is said that they become extinct because of a comet actually hit the world, etc. So we can ask this question: even if there was no comet hitting the earth, maybe the evolutionary process could be very different from it is now, right? This is the basic idea. So basically we start from here, and two options, two choices. If you choose this direction, you will go in this direction, and if you choose this other choice, you will go in that direction. Of course, throughout the whole of the evolutionary process, we have this bifurcations and choices, etc., etc. So evolutionary process is basically is more or less random process, but at the same time it conforms to deterministic processes. It's a blend of both determinism and randomness, so to speak. The choice here is made in a random fashion. You cannot predict it, actually. But within these choices, the process is pretty deterministic. So basically, you can predict what's going on within this short or long, doesn't matter, interval in which there is also an equilibrium. So it's a kind of punctuated equilibrium. There are also punctures within the evolutionary process, but between two punctures, we have this relatively stable equilibrium and evolutionary process. So evolution does not necessarily mean small, that it occurs with small steps. It may occur through some big leaps, so to speak, or breaks or punctures. But within these punctures, of course, we may have relatively stable periods. Again, here, the same idea occurs. Okay, this is better, right? So we start from here, two options. If you go this direction, there may be another choice here and also here, etc. If you go this direction, for example, we started from here, and at that point, there are two options. One option is the path along which dinosaurs would evolve if there was no comet hitting the world. But on the other hand, this other choice, other path, is the path of human beings eventually, etc. So we are here somewhere, but the system did not choose. This wasn't a deliberate choice, of course, conscious choice, as we said. So basically, this is the notion of punctuated equilibrium, and it argues that basically there are both randomness and deterministic elements within an evolutionary process. So evolution is a very complicated process, but the idea is, okay, there are in the Wikipedia pages, you can see different examples of the things. Okay, here is another representation. Here we have start with change. There's an equilibrium process. Of course, equilibrium does not mean that there is no change. There are changes, but these changes are gradual. They occur in a gradual fashion, step by step, one by one. So in the end, we come here, but then there's another mutation, another break, which will bring about a new species, for example. And then again, a relatively stable period follows this break, etc. So this is the notion of punctuated equilibrium. And Marx tried to, according to Engels, of course, in Marx's funeral, Marx tried to develop the laws of change or evolution in social systems, so to speak, whereas Darwin developed the laws for the biological evolution, and Marx and Engels had a great admiration for Darwin, and Marx also sent a copy of his book, Das Kapital, to Darwin. Darwin didn't read it, but it's okay for Marx. And so Marx's theory can be seen as a kind of evolutionary theory. Of course, there are different interpretations of the evolutionary theory in general. There is the Darwin approach.
I'm sorry, Professor, but Marx's theory was about socialization, yeah?
Different theories also in the social systems or in history. There are different interpretations of evolutionary process, but it seems that at least Marx's
I'm sorry, Professor.
Position
but Marx's theory was about socialization.
To this punctuated equilibrium notion, and this notion was also emphasized by Schumpeter And Schumpeter argues that the evolutionary process is a process in which the next step of the process cannot be predicted on the basis of the present state. So there's always an element of randomness, so to speak. In biology, this is created by mutations, right? In the social system, it could be other things, any form of technology. Remember, historical materialism is about historical change, and behind this change, it is argued mostly by Marxists, is the technological developments, etc. So in this process, history should be seen as a non-teleological process characterized by complexities and path dependencies. Path dependency idea is relatively simple. Remember, you may be familiar with this idea. One of the most frequently used examples is the famous Qwerty phenomenon. The keyboard. If you look at your computer's keyboard, you can see that there's Q and then W, E, R, T, Y, English type of keyboard, of course, we are talking about here. Qwerty. This first arrangement of the letters was introduced in the late 19th century when the typewriters were invented. So this is the most efficient arrangement of the letters for the mechanical typewriters, because it reduces the possibility of the letters to become interlinked and stop, etc. It's a mechanical process. Of course, you are not old enough to remember how a mechanical typewriter works, but if you see that, it is said usually that this Qwerty arrangement is the most efficient type of arrangement. In Turkish, for example, there's this F type. It starts with F rather than Q, and this is, I think, especially, it's my personal belief that this is the most efficient arrangement for Turkish language if you want to write Turkish by using typewriter or computer. It's the most efficient one, but unfortunately, no one uses it. Why? Well, there may be some complicated reasons for this that we don't need to go into detail. Anyway, this Qwerty arrangement was developed for the mechanical typewriters, but today we use electronic tools, computers, etc., and the electronic computers are not vulnerable to these kind of mechanical failures, but still we use this kind of arrangement. This is an example to the path dependence. Once the system chooses this way or another a particular path, and this path will be followed no matter what. This is again the idea of punctuated equilibrium, right? Once we made a choice, we should follow this path until the next choice or next break, etc. The same applies to, for example, the same idea applies to the development of car engines, for example. Combustible engines were introduced in the late 19th century, but in the 1920s, for example, there had been three types of car engines. One is the steam engines were used in the cars, especially trucks and so forth. And the other was the combustible engine, and the third one is the electric car. And the technology of the electric car at that time in the 1920s was not so different from that of ours. Today still we have batteries, and batteries must be charged, and it is used as the source of power, etc. Again, the same idea were developed in the the beginning of the 20th century. But even if this technology were known, it wasn't used because the system at that time, some people argue that oil was an important factor for the choice of this type of engine, because oil becomes cheap and so forth. So, and even they argue that combustible engines are more efficient than the others, which is debatable actually. But steam engine is very interesting. So this choice was made in the beginning of the 20th century, and today in the 21st century, we try to develop new forms of electric cars, etc. You know, if at that time in the 1920s, we can ask that if the electric car was to be chosen, then everything could be different now, right? Today we talk about climate changes and you know, environmental pollution, etc. Because of the fossil fuel. So everything could have been different, right? So once we enter into a particular path, we should follow to the end. That's the basic idea. So anyway, from this we can say that, according to Marx especially, capitalism is inherently dynamic, and this dynamic element also involves some kind of instabilities and crises, of course. Change and evolution is both a strength of capitalism, because it will bring about constant increases in the capital accumulation process, and it's a weakness because it will prone to instabilities and crises. That's the basic idea. Okay, the third conclusion could be that the notion of human nature, a kind of conception of human nature or human essence, is important. Human nature in the sense that, in the sense of the human developmental potential. This is, again, a dynamically, inherently dynamic notion, actually. You know, the human essence, it basically refers to what are the specific conditions that make us human beings, right? How can we define ourselves as human beings? So this is important, and following the Aristotelian tradition, Marx argues that the human essence is to be defined on the basis of human developmental potential, and the aim of life, the objective of life in this regard, is again this realization of potential self-realization, so that we become full-fledged human beings, so to speak. So basically, Marx is careful to distinguish between general aspects of history and the specific aspects of history. You know, human behavior sometimes depend on the specific mode of production in which human beings live, such as the notion of Homo economicus, for example, is applicable to human beings in a capitalist system, but it does not have a general validity for other pre-capitalist modes of production. But on the other hand, there are some constant elements in human history, you know, such as this human essence, developmental potential. Every one of us has these potentials just because of the fact that, just by virtue of the fact that we are human beings, we are members of the human species. So we have these potentials, and our aim, both individually and also from the perspective of human beings in general, species, our aim is to realize ourselves through the realization, self-realization of the potentialities that we have, basically. So basically, on the basis of this notion of human nature, we can also develop a conception of society and social change. And therefore, the interaction between human nature and actual social institutions are an important subject matter of Marxian political economy. For Marxian political economy is normative, not necessarily positive. Remember positive normative distinction. Normative refers to values in general, what is right, what is wrong, what is valuable, etc. In that sense, Marxian economics is normative in the sense that, of course, in a limited sense, that it should rest on the view that human beings are essentially moral beings who are concerned with good life. This good life, again, is an Aristotelian notion. It refers to self-realization, basically. We can reach a good life only through self-realization, realization of our own potential. So basically, human beings are concerned with achieving a good life, even according to Marx. Well, of course, this is a matter of controversy within Marxian circles. Remember Althusser. Althusser says that this idea belongs to young Marx, earlier Marx, but the old Marx, later works, he abandons these kinds of conceptions and moral ethical arguments, and he develops political economy as a science. It's a positive science, not necessarily a normative one. It's not about humanization and so forth, but it's about the working capitalism, etc. So there is still a debate going on with regard to this issue. But if you believe that there's a continuity within Marx, between the young Marx and the mature Marx, so to speak, they must complement each other, or rather we can say that the old Marxist argument, political economy as a science, so to speak, must be based upon and actually rests upon Marx's earlier workings that emphasizes the importance of self-realization, human freedom, moral elements, etc., etc. This is at least my understanding. And 4, 5 antinomies or contradictions are important in the human realm. There are some important contradictions within the human realm. Freedom, contradiction between freedom and necessity. We are both free and unfree, so to speak. And individuality and sociality. This is a kind of anti-reductionist position, I would say. I mean, if you want to understand human beings, you must consider both sides of this human existence. Human existence is important to understand also human history, and in order to grasp grasp the working of human history and also capitalism, we must consider this contradictory element that exists in human history and in capitalism. Right? In human history can be seen from an ethical perspective, for example, as a constant struggle between freedom and unfreedom, so to speak. Capitalism represents a more developed stage within the human history, in the sense that it brings about new opportunities for human self-realization, and therefore enjoying greater freedoms in general, but at the same time it restricts human freedom because it creates fetishism, alienation, reification, etc. So with respect to capitalism, we have this contradictory element in terms of human development, so to speak, and also in terms of capital accumulation process and even the working of the system in general. We cannot escape these kinds of contradictions, and contradictions are important to understand capitalism. They are also important to understand human history, because human history can be seen as a constant struggle between freedom and unfreedom, or freedom and necessity. Kant, for example, argues that the category of necessity refers to or belongs to the realm of nature, natural rights, natural laws, and deterministic processes are prevalent within nature. But when we are to talk about freedom, it's a human category, it applies to humans. So there's a sharp distinction here. There's a sharp duality between freedom and necessity. On the other hand, Hegel argues that, for example, there's no such thing as human freedom. Maybe we can talk about the freedom of the spirit, the cosmological entity that determines everything happening in the world, basically. But in terms of human subjects, there's no such thing as freedom, only we have to obey, and we do obey, actually, the category of necessity, right? Everything that occurs by necessity. That's the basic idea. There's no such thing as human freedom. And Marx is, well, it can be said at least in between these two types of positions. According to Marx, human beings are subject to laws of nature and laws of necessity, but at the same time, they have the power of changing history, so to speak, power of transformation, making transformations, power of self-realization, labor power in general, physical and mental capabilities that every human being has. That's the basic idea. So we are both free and, unfortunately, unfree at the same time. This is contradiction. Again, another aspect is important. Production is a social process, and we are talking about political economy, right? Economics is a political science, so to speak. Today, we usually argue, economists usually argue that we have nothing to do with political processes. We only talk about economic policy. Other than that, politics is not important. But politics is important because human beings are political beings. As Aristotle says, we are political animals. We live in a society. We are social beings, and our own identity is developed within a process in which there are constant interactions between the individual and the society in general. Sometimes we have to obey the rules or structures of society, but other times we rebel against the society, social norms, ethical norms, morality, sometimes the restrictions that the social relations or structures impose upon us. So it's a constant struggle for human beings, again, to become free to a greater extent. So basically, economics should consider the importance of this social or political element. The emergence of institutions through socialization or emulation process should also be considered. This notion of emulation is a notion that was introduced by institutionalist writers, actually. It's a kind of socialization process. We become individuals in a social process. We are all social beings and individual beings, another contradiction, of course, but still, sometimes we emulate the others and we obey the rules of the society, and other times, of course, we try to change them, etc. And also, capitalist accumulation is a dynamic and contradictory process, as we have talked, full of turbulences and crises. Also, the idea that very success of capitalism is the basic cause of its failure. The self-destruction argument, this argument is developed, not developed by, adopted by Marx. The same idea exists in Adam Smith, actually. Capitalism is, again, dynamic process. dynamic system, it creates equilibrium and disequilibrium and instabilities and so forth. Again, Schumpeter's famous idea of creative destruction refers to same kind of understanding. Capitalism is a successful system, but this success will bring about its failure. This is, again, a contradictory statement, maybe, but this contradiction emerges from the very system itself, not from our own thinking. Anyway, and also social processes and class struggle can be seen as expression of human essence. Objectification and alienation are two different processes. Remember, objectification refers to our own projection of our own essence into the world. We create ourselves, so to speak, through production, through constant creating something. This creation is also a self-creation process. It's called objectification by Marx. It's a kind of projection of our essences into the world, to use the Hegelian language. And also, sometimes it may become alienation because of the existence of private property, remember, and alienation and fetishism, and therefore reification processes actually is a process that strips ourselves of our own freedom and of our own transformative power, so to speak. We are controlled by the commodities, and our relations become relations among commodities, etc. So this is the loss of freedom, loss of power. We become powerless, we become isolated, and this is a process of dehumanization in this sense. Anyway, so, but, capitalism creates these kinds of tendencies for fetishism and reification. But as human beings, we know that deep down, this is not right. So we come to resist towards these alienation processes. And this kind of resistance shows itself, manifests itself in the form of class struggle. We know that as a laborer, for example, we know that we come to know that actually it's a process of exploitation, and we become exploited, and therefore we become powerless and isolated, etc. So we have to resist against this, and we should reach self-consciousness, form a class. We should realize that we are part of the class and struggle against capitalist and their effects on the society, etc. And also, this predatory and workmanship instinct is a distinction developed by Veblen, institutionalist economist, founder of institutionalism, actually. It's again the same idea or similar idea. On the one hand, there's this predatory instinct on the part of the capitalists, or what Veblen calls the captains of the industry. They are concerned with profit, basically. They don't care about any kind of human elements, etc. But on the other hand, there's this workmanship instinct, which means basically the power that exists in all human beings for working. Work again is a positive thing in the sense that it helps us to develop our own potentials and ourselves in general. So the idea is more or less the same. Maybe not the same, but quite similar. Anyway, so basically, these are important points to be learned from Marx. And of course, you must have realized that these points are not only important in Marx, but also in some other economists in the history of economics. We can encounter with these or similar kind of ideas. This notion of essence's existence, etc., is embraced by the classical political economy in general, not Ricardo maybe, but Adam Smith for sure. And also Marx belongs to this school. He considers himself as belonging to this classical political economy. And also this notion of evolutionary complexity is an important element of the evolutionary economics that develops recently. And also it's an important part of the institutional school, when criticized neoclassical economics as not being an evolutionary science. And he also thinks, by the way, that Marx's theory is not a good evolutionary theory, or is not an evolutionary theory at all. It's not a good theory. That's his criticism. But we can say that, especially for the human history, for the ideas of Marx about human history and the working of capitalism, it would not be wrong to characterize it as a kind of evolutionary approach, which is different from that of the Weblenian type or the evolutionary type or the Schumpeterian type, maybe. Again, Schumpeter is an important economist in this regard. And some recent heterodox traditions, like the post-Keynesian school, for example, also embraces some elements of these types of understanding. The evolutionary processes, maybe the importance of the non-ergodicity or the blend of the determinism and randomness and so forth. So these are important. But Marx, methodologically speaking, also is an important thinker that understood at least the importance of these kinds of elements. And also this human nature is important. Economics is a political science, it's an ethical science, politics is about polis, ethics is about good life, and economics is about oikos, right? Oikos meaning household. But according to Aristotle, ethics is important for both politics and oikos, economics, because a good life for individual could be possible only through a good life for the oikos, and therefore for the polis. A self-sufficient polis is required for a self-sufficient oikos, which is also important for the self-sufficient individual. Self-sufficient person, the category of individual, is barely encountered within the ancient Greek philosophy. It's not about individuals, as in the liberal tradition, for example. It's about society or polis or community in general. So this is an important aspect of also Marx, but also Marx also cherishes, so to speak, the importance of individual freedom. So his aspiration is about reaching a society in which individuals are both free, both individuals and society as a whole, or human beings as a species, is free. We are free as an individual person, but also freedom of humanity as a whole is of the utmost importance from this perspective. And in this regard, we can say that political economy is an ethical science. Even in Marx, we have this same idea. And this this conception is more or less based upon the notion of contradiction. Contradictions are important, both for the human existence and for the working of capitalism in general. And from this, of course, capital accumulation process is also a contradictory process. It creates the potentials for growth in general and increasing wealth, but at the same time, it creates the tendencies for the destruction of the system as a whole in the form of crises, for example. And human beings are important. The basic subject for the Marxian economics or Marxian political economy is the human being herself. That's the most important aspect of Marxist political economy, I would say. And I think it's enough for today and for the class in general. Thank you very much for listening.